Africa is blessed with enormous natural resources beyond human imaginations, but African leaders have not been able to galvanize themselves and others to benefit from its abundant blessings. But the game is changing, and the Africans has risen.
Our success should be based on the fact that we have a common vision. It's not because we have a common border. That makes our strength. So this is strategically is very important. The continental free trade area is going to be the biggest free trade area in the world, in our planet, and supported by the digital engine or digital technology engine that the Smart Africa has been spearheading for the past 10 years. I think this is where we should be seeing the success.
Africa isn't making a big deal out of its digital future. It is being constructed discreetly, piece by piece, and out of the spotlight. Additionally, you might have missed the subtle change in the continent's course if you weren't paying attention to what transpired in Conakry this year. Heads of state, ministers, and innovators convened for 3 days to create a new reality rather than recite well-known speeches. Africa aims to become a single digital market by 2030. Not as a hopeful concept, but as an operational system that is currently in place. This summit felt distinct because of the gravity in the room more than the size of the event. People talked as if they had deadlines instead of dreams. Projects were defined as continuous labor rather than goals for the future. It was evident that something had changed, not loudly, firmly, and it compels a straightforward inquiry. Is the world prepared for Africa to become digitally unified? Let's investigate. Africa has been talking about digital transformation for years. There have been countless conferences, approaches, and frameworks. However, the tone had shifted this time. It didn't feel like another round of ideas during the 7th Transform Africa Summit. It had the atmosphere of a workshop for engineers. Ministries discussed implementation more than concepts. Technologists discussed prototypes more than potential. Furthermore, the institution spearheading this continental campaign, Smart Africa, did not act like a think tank. It acted as though it were an organization carrying out a multi-year construction project. The summit's main point, which was occasionally spoken explicitly and other times hinted at, was straightforward. Africa plans to operate as a unified digital market by 2030. Intends, not strives, hopes, or could in the future. Dramatic slogans were not used to convey the intention. Officials' explanations of timescales, project managers' descriptions of integration stages, and partners' descriptions of Africa as a single rising digital bloc rather than as 54 separate markets all demonstrated this. It was significant that this conference was held in Conakry, the first Francophone metropolis in West Africa. It demonstrated that the campaign wasn't being spearheaded by a small number of digitally savvy nations or a specific region. It was gradually turning into a continent. Something bigger is starting to take shape when leaders from West, East, Central, Southern, and North Africa gather under one roof to talk about digital identity, cross-border payments, uniform data sharing, and AI governance using the same vernacular. The optimism wasn't what was most noticeable, it was maturity. Digital ambition is no longer seen as a luxury or optional upgrade in Africa. It is seen as infrastructure, just as vital as roads, water, and electricity. The importance of digital integration was succinctly explained by the speakers. That element was previously clear to everyone. The new emphasis was on how quickly it could be completed, what technical challenges still existed, and which collaborations could speed up the process. Sanya, the platform that links investors and entrepreneurs, wasn't portrayed as a pipe dream. It was said to be an urgently needed tool for Africa. The SADC pilot project connecting Ghana, Benin, and Rwanda was not presented as an experiment. It was introduced as an enlarged model. Digital ID was presented as a foundation being built brick by brick rather than as something that would happen immediately. The message was unmistakable by the summit's conclusion. Beyond particular national policies, Africa is setting the stage for something greater. It is getting ready to function as a single digital entity. However, this inevitably raises another query. Why now, And where does this newfound assurance and clarity come from? Conakry's self-assurance didn't just happen. It wasn't an epiphany or a moment of inspiration. It was the outcome of something that Africa hasn't experienced in a very long time. Alignment. Silent, steady. Technical congruence. The kind that doesn't make news but, once it begins to take shape, transforms everything. African nations have been working independently on digital projects for years. Rwanda promoted digital identity. Kenya's fintech innovation. Ghana investigated interoperability. Nigeria made startup investments. Cybersecurity frameworks were developed in South Africa. However, these initiatives flowed in diverse directions like distinct rivers, each full of potential. Slowly but steadily, astute Africa has been able to reroute these rivers into a common ocean. The partnership has changed. It was mostly used for discussions, proclamations, and plans 10 years ago. These days, it functions more like an organization that manages several building sites throughout the continent. A member state is committing to alignment when it joins on, not participating in talks. You could also sense how profoundly that alignment is starting to take hold in Conakry. The way the new alliances were presented was one of the most obvious indicators. Nobody used promotional language. People conversed as if they were working together on a long-term project. For instance, the agreement with Youth Connect wasn't presented as an ostentatious youth project. Millions of young Africans are being prepared for the digital economy they will soon inherit through what has been called a pipeline. The collaboration with Visa wasn't presented as a business innovation. It was a crucial component of a developing infrastructure for cross-border payments. The partnership between Rwanda, Benin, and Ghana through digital solutions was not a test run. It served as the foundation for a framework of continental identity. This is what alignment-based confidence looks like, tangible actions rather than catchphrases. The way African leaders now discuss digital sovereignty is another significant change. The concept seemed idealistic a few years ago. It sounded sensible in Conakry. Governments are aware of the limitations of digital instruments created by others. Systems for identifying people are hosted somewhere else. Information kept externally. Foreign networks are used to route payments. Africa is now viewing these dependencies as vulnerabilities that must be addressed immediately rather than later, since they restrict autonomy. Conversations on cybersecurity, which were previously incidental, are now central to policy. Programs for digital skills that were previously dispersed are being unified. Initiatives that bolster local sovereignty are even reclaiming internet governance, an area that Africa has traditionally ceded to external entities. However, the most significant change may be psychological. African politicians no longer talk about the continent having to catch up to other continents. They talk as though Africa is creating its own route, one that reflects its own population, needs, and economic rhythm, rather than imitating Europe, Asia, or North America. That clarity fosters confidence, not loud confidence, but quiet confidence, the kind that makes advancement seem real rather than speculative. And a new question inevitably arises when African nations start heading in the same path. In what ways would this alignment genuinely enhance the lives of common Africans throughout the continent? The single digital market boils down to one straightforward concept when the partnerships, strategy documents, and policy wording are removed. Simplifying daily life for millions of Africans who spend too much time battling systems that ought to be supporting them rather than working against them. Africa's biggest digital issue for decades wasn't a lack of talent or ideas, but rather friction, small roadblocks everywhere. A company operating in one nation suddenly becoming stuck in another, a mobile wallet that is accepted at home becoming useless across a border, and government services that require lengthy wait times, lengthy paperwork, or lengthy explanations. Everyone is aware of how draining it is. The aim of a single digital market is to eliminate that friction in a calm, consistent, and practical manner rather than to create some mythical future where technology fixes every issue. Take digital identity as an example of the kind of shift you experience in your daily life, rather than merely in national statistics. Moving between nations these days frequently requires repeatedly establishing your identity through various pieces of identification, new registrations, and new processes to become familiar with. With a single digital identity, you may be acknowledged securely, quickly, and consistently across national boundaries. It just works. You don't think about it. This also applies to payments. Nearly everyone on the continent has encountered the frustration of attempting to transmit money across borders or purchase services in another African nation. That barrier is eliminated by a unified payment system. A phone number becomes a wallet becomes continental, and all of a sudden, what seemed complex becomes commonplace. The impact is significantly greater for small firms. To reach clients in Harare or Johannesburg, a seller in Lusaka shouldn't have to completely redo their business plan. To serve a market that is only a few hours away, an Accra fashion designer shouldn't need 10 separate platforms. Exporting within Africa will be simpler than ever if digital barriers are removed. A local company grows into a regional enterprise without incurring the typical costs and bureaucratic burdens. Access to services comes next. These days, an entrepreneur may find it difficult to obtain information or assistance if their nation lacks the appropriate system. That can be fixed with a single digital market. Why shouldn't a Guinean citizen be able to take advantage of Rwanda's world-class digital public service using interoperable platforms? Why should opportunities and potential be divided by borders that were drawn on a map decades ago? However, psychological changes are the most significant. People behave differently, dream bigger, plan farther, and move with greater confidence when systems function well because their ambitions are ultimately supported by their surroundings. What really changes economies is that modest but potent adjustment in perspective. The fact that our healthcare system is currently facing difficulties is one of the things that truly strikes us. Access to medication is one aspect of it. Another is ensuring that the medication you do obtain is genuine, and we think we can help with this through technology. However, as life on the continent gets easier, something else begins to take place outside of it. The outside world starts to pay more attention as Africa starts to break down its internal walls. This begs the question of how world powers are responding to a continent that is growing more independent and digitally linked. The outside world always responds when a continent begins resolving its internal issues, sometimes subtly, strategically, and other times with a hint of unease. That's precisely what's taking place right now. Big players from outside the continent are paying much more attention as Africa starts to reduce digital friction. The balance of digital dependency is beginning to change, not because Africa is requesting consent. For many years, Africa was mostly dependent on systems, payment rails, cloud infrastructure, cybersecurity frameworks, identification tools, and even simple government software that was developed abroad. Many of these systems were helpful, so they weren't always awful. However, they had drawbacks. Pricing is regulated worldwide, rules are written elsewhere, data is held abroad, and digital policies are developed with external interests in mind. Additionally, those restrictions remained undetectable as long as African nations remained out of alignment. They are no longer invisible. The global tech scene was affected as soon as nations started coordinating digital identities, connecting data exchange systems, and combining payment frameworks. It is evident in the increased competition foreign businesses have for partnerships in Africa. The terminology has changed, with terms like co-creation, collaboration, and joint development becoming far more common. When Africa is suddenly featured in sessions at international conferences that have not previously covered the region, you can tell. This is not an accident. The world is aware of what a united digital Africa entails. The world's greatest youth population entering a common digital environment. A market larger than the EU starting to take shape, and an innovation ecosystem based on African goals rather than being influenced by outside donors. This, of course, produces a variety of reactions. Opportunities exist in certain nations. They acknowledge the benefits of a stable, unified African digital market for international trade. It entails more precise regulations, dependable procedures, and appropriate digital infrastructure. These performers are bending closer. They are looking for long-term collaborations. They recognize that Africa is no longer a threat. It's a significant digital frontier, but some are more circumspect. Controlling its own data, cybersecurity, and digital identity makes a continent less vulnerable to outside pressure, less dependent, and less influential. For many years, foreign actors found it simpler to operate nationally in Africa due to the continent's fragmented digital ecosystem, influencing policy through bilateral agreements. That is altered by a unified framework. It reduces the amount of room available for negotiations. It modifies the balance of power. Some nations fear that Africa's newfound sovereignty may make it more difficult to enforce their own digital interests. Others worry that as Africa unites, it may turn to allies who value autonomy more, particularly new digital powers that provide infrastructure without political restrictions. However, the quiet response is the most intriguing. Suddenly, international organizations are framing Africa as an equal digital participant rather than a consumer of technology. This change is gradually yet clearly noticeable. Africa is not being discussed as a potential market. It's being spoken about as an integration partner. Everyone is observing that the world is changing, some enthusiastically and some regretfully. The following question becomes clear once you realize that. What will Africa's digital landscape look like by 2030 if the world is already responding so strongly? Africa in 2030 doesn't like the continent most people envision today if you project the continent's current trajectory ahead, even conservatively. It appears to be more internally connected, coordinated, and structured than at any other time in contemporary history. Not flawless, not consistent, but coherent. And it's this coherence that transforms everything. Begin with the fundamentals. Moving over the continent is made easier by a single digital identity system. Verification speeds up. Services become less geographically dependent. We are discussing a scenario in which an individual from Ghana may authenticate themselves in Rwanda with the same ease as they do at home, or in which a Dakar-incorporated company can function internationally without having to completely rebuild its administrative framework each time. Although it may sound subtle, this type of infrastructure subtly changes how people work and live. The digital economy is another. An African entrepreneur won't be wondering, how do we enter a new country in 2030? Which region of the continental market should we scale to first? Just the psychological change is enormous. Entrepreneurs' goals shift when they see that the continent is opening rather than closed. You cease creating for a city or an area. Products, services, software, and platforms that are larger, more intelligent, and more robust are encouraged when you build for a billion-person market. Additionally, payments will feel different, gradually rather than all at once. Every year, more digital tools will function seamlessly across borders, more systems will connect, and more currencies will merge. A baker in Dar es Salaam won't handle selling to clients in Lusaka as a complex global business. A client in Abidjan will pay a freelance designer in Nairobi just as easily as they would with a local transfer. This is not theory. It is already taking place in bits and pieces. It is merely scaled up by a single digital market. Governments will also act differently by 2030. There will be less isolation in policymaking. There is no reason why Malawi, Guinea, or Botswana cannot adopt an efficient framework for AI governance if Kenya does. Rwanda has the potential to become a continental model if it establishes a robust cybersecurity protocol. You get a shared library of functional systems, with each nation enhancing what others have already created, rather than 50 distinct experiments operating simultaneously. The pipeline for talent and education will also change. Digital skills will be taught for continental opportunities, as well as for local use. A young African studying cloud architecture, artificial intelligence, or software development will be entering a job market that stretches from Lagos to Kigali to Casablanca to Cape Town. The paths expand because systems start communicating with each other, not because boundaries vanish. And confidence will probably be the biggest shift in 2030. A continent that previously viewed itself as dependent on the rest of the world will start to act as a region creating its own digital architecture. That change, internal, psychological, and cultural, might be the most revolutionary of all. However, if Africa becomes thus unified and technologically advanced by 2030, a more significant question starts to emerge. When Africa eventually launches its own digital market and begins engaging in international negotiations as a single digital power, what will happen on a global scale? The moment Africa activates its unified digital market will feel more like a quiet turning point than a sudden event if everything keeps going as planned. The good people don't completely realize this till years later. There won't be a big announcement or fireworks. Rather, the world will gradually become aware that something has changed. Africa will speak as a coordinated digital force with momentum, structure, and influence rather than as 54 digital shards. Leverage is important. For many years, fragmentation has influenced international agreements, including Africa in commerce, technology, data governance, and investment. Businesses could get a footing in one market and use it to influence another. Bilateral agreements that favored one state while ignoring others could be reached by governments. Due to the wide variations in digital standards, there were gaps that gave foreign players more power than the continent frequently recognized. That dynamic is instantly altered by a single market. Africa gets unprecedented negotiating strength when infrastructure, identification, payment systems, and data frameworks become interoperable. Think about the practical implications of that. Instead of a single national decision, a global tech giant attempting to influence data policy in one African nation will suddenly have to deal with a framework spanning the entire continent. If licensing systems are harmonized and aligned, a foreign telecom operator cannot pit nations against one another for market access. Instead of focusing only on a few markets and ignoring the others, a payment company that wants to dominate must now integrate into a continental system. Quietly but decisively, Africa gains the upper hand. The change will also be felt by investors. In the past, breaking into African markets meant negotiating a complex web of laws, several currencies, and fragmented infrastructures. Investment is far more scalable, less hazardous, and more predictable in a unified digital market. Investors receive a company that services an entire continent rather than a startup that serves a single city or region. Just that modifies the way international capital enters African innovation ecosystems. The ramifications are considerably more extensive in terms of geopolitics. Africa will no longer be viewed as merely a location where international powers use digital tools. It develops, regulates, and exports its own systems. Africa is already creating digital standards rather than merely adopting them, so nations that previously viewed the region as a consumer market will need to change. And that acknowledgement is accompanied with respect, the type that must be earned via coherence, structure, and scale rather than given freely. Perhaps the most significant of all is the psychological change occurring within the continent. Africans will perceive themselves more and more as members of a cohesive totality rather than as separate national economies. Instead of the limitations of limited marketplaces, young professionals will experience the potential of a global digital world. Companies will prioritize continents over countries. Governments will take a more comprehensive approach to policy. Once established, this group worldview is difficult to change. Therefore, more robust government support is required to encourage entrepreneurship. Then, in order to collaborate with venture capital funds, to address corporate concerns and digitization so that we can invest in the businesses that address their issues, we need greater corporate cooperation. Africa won't publicly declare itself to be a digital power in many respects. Simply put, it will unite through alignment, consistency, and gradually constructed architecture throughout time. And one question will reverberate far beyond Africa's boundaries when the time comes for the systems to finally integrate, the borders to soften digitally, and the infrastructure to start humming across regions. When Africa negotiates, innovates, and functions as a single digital giant instead of a dispersed collection of markets, how will the rest of the globe adapt? Because the transition won't be happening at that point. It will be here already. Do you believe that Africa is now prepared to function as a single digital market? Which nation do you think will gain the most from this change? Let us know in the comments section.